In W. H. Mallock's satire, The New Republic, which was first published in the 1870s, at a time when the conflict between science and religion was at its height, a character representing Dr. Jowett is made to admit that an atheist opponent can disprove the existence of God as he would define him. All atheists can do that. This doesn't, however, disturb the doctor's faith. For, he says, the world has at present no adequate definition of God, and I think we should be able to define a thing before we can satisfactorily disprove it. I said this was a satire, but the words which are put into Jowett's mouth represent a point of view which is still not uncommon. People who try to justify their belief in the existence of God by saying that it rests on faith are sometimes maintaining no more than that the proposition that God exists is one which they have the right to accept in default of sufficient evidence. But sometimes they look to faith for the assurance that the words God exists express some true proposition, though they do not know what this proposition is. It is one that surpasses human understanding. The first of these positions is discussable, though I think it misguided, but the second is merely disingenuous. Until we have an intelligible proposition before us, there is nothing for faith to get to work on. It can be an article of faith that beings of superhuman intelligence, if there are any, entertain propositions that we cannot grasp. This requires only that we can make sense of the expression, beings with superhuman intelligence. But if we really cannot grasp these propositions, if the sentences which purport to express them have no meaning for us, then the fact, if it were a fact, they did have meaning for some other beings, would be of little interest to us, for this meaning might be anything whatsoever. The truth is, however, that those who take this position do understand, or think they understand something by the words God exists. It is only when the account they give of what they understand appears unworthy of credence that they take refuge in saying that it falls short of what the words really mean. But words have no meaning beyond the meaning that is given them, and a proposition is not made the more credible by being treated as an approximation to something that we do not find intelligible. In fact, the world is not without descriptions of gods, whether or not they severally or collectively count as adequate definitions. Until we are provided with a criterion of adequacy, this is a detail that need not detain us. Thus, those who believe in many gods tend to ascribe properties to them which fit the human activities over which they are thought to preside. The god of war is martial, the god of love amorous. In some, though not in all cases, these gods are at least intermittently corporeal, and they operate in space and time. Those who believe that there is just one God are in general agreement that he is an intelligent person, or something like one, that he feels emotions such as love or moral indignation, that he is incorporeal, except in the case of the Christian God, when, for a period of about 30 years, if one assumes the identity of the Son and the Father, he had what are ordinarily supposed to be the incompatible properties of being both corporeal and incorporeal, that again with this exception he is not located in space, though capable of acting in space, that he is either eternal, or with the same exception not located in time, though capable of acting in time, that he created the world and continues to oversee it, that he is not subject to change, that he is all-powerful and all-knowing, that he is morally perfect and consequently supremely benevolent, and that he necessarily exists. There may be some doubt whether the predicates that are ascribed to this one God are all of them meaningful or mutually consistent. For instance, there is reason to think that if the notion of disembodied persons is intelligible at all, they must at least be located in time. Neither is it clear how a being that feels emotions can fail to be subject to change, unless we suppose that he feels the same emotions with the same intensity all the time, in which case there must be some danger of their sometimes lacking their appropriate objects. What is anyhow obvious is that these different predicates are for the most part not logically connected. We shall have to consider later on whether it is possible to make sense of the idea that the world was created. If this is a significant proposition, it may be taken to entail that the Creator was intelligent. It may also be taken to entail that he was incorporeal, on the ground that the existence of a physical body could not precede the existence of the universe, though then it is not clear why the same should not apply to the existence of a mind. It surely does not entail that the Creator is eternal. He might have come into existence at any time before he created the world, or ceased to exist any time after. Neither does it entail that he is all-powerful. He might have wished but been unable to create a different world. Having created the world that he did, he might subsequently have found that it escaped wholly or partly from his control. It might also develop in ways that he was unable to foresee. Clearly also, there is no logical connection between having any degree of power, including the power to create the universe, and being morally good. Indeed, if one thought of the world's history as having been planned by its creator, a strong case could be made for inferring that he was malevolent. Finally, even if the creator could consistently possess all these other properties, it would not follow that he necessarily existed. If he was thought to be a god, his possession of them might be necessary, in the sense that they were ascribed to any god by definition, but this would not entail that it wasn't a contingent proposition that the definition was actually satisfied. The idea that God necessarily exists is worth pursuing, since it is involved in two of the best-known attempts to prove that there is a God. The first of these is originally due to St. Anselm, and has come to be known as the ontological argument. A version of it, not significantly different from St. Anselm's, was also advanced by Descartes. The first premise of the argument is that God is perfect, in a sense which implies that no greater being is imaginable. This is taken to be true by definition. We are not told exactly what is comprised in perfection or greatness, but this doesn't matter to the argument, as long as it can proceed to its second premise, which is that a merely imaginary being is not so great as a real one. This also is taken to be true by definition. It is then argued that if God did not exist, he would not be the greatest being imaginable. But since by definition he is the greatest being imaginable, it follows that he exists. To say that he exists necessarily is, in this context, just to say that his existence follows from his essence, or in other words, from the way he has been defined. Though some philosophers, even in our own day, have been convinced by this argument, it is surely fallacious. The most common way of rebutting it, which was suggested by Kant, is to deny that anything can include existence in its definition. To define an object is to list the predicates which it has to satisfy, and existence, it is said, is not a predicate. For example, one may define a centaur as a creature with the head, trunk, and arms of a man joined to the body and legs of a horse. If one then goes on to say that centaurs exist, one is not adding another property to the definition, or predicating anything of the objects which it applies, as one would be if one said that centaurs are bellicose. One is making a statement of a different order, namely the false statement that the definition is satisfied. In the same way, one may enumerate the properties which constitute a god's perfection, as consisting in omnipotence, omniscience, supreme benevolence, or whatever. But in adding existence, one is not listing a further property. One is saying, truly or falsely, that there is something to which they belong. I think that this answer is along the right lines, but it is not entirely satisfactory, because it places too much emphasis on a rule for framing definitions which one might think could be broken. For instance, if one looks up the word centaur in a dictionary, one will find that centaurs are credited not only with the properties that I listed, but also with being fabulous. If this were taken seriously as part of the definition, then, in the improbable event that anything was found to answer to the other specifications of a centaur, it could not properly be called one. Some other term would have to be found to designate this creature, which differed from a centaur just in not being fabulous. In the same way, I suppose that someone could insist on making it part of the sense of the term God, or indeed of any other term, that it carried an assumption of existence. For such a person, to say God does not exist would be a misuse of language, because the attribute of non-existence would deny what the use of the subject term had presupposed. But now it becomes clear that nothing is gained by this manoeuvre, since it remains an open question whether the subject term has any use. Let it be written into the definition of a perfect being that he is not imaginary. The question whether there is anything that has all the other properties of a perfect being and is also not imaginary can still significantly be answered no. Thus, even if we allowed St. Anselm that to conceive of the greatest imaginable being is to conceive of him as existing, it will not follow that there actually is anything to which this concept applies. Does it make any difference if God is defined as a necessary being? There is some difficulty in understanding what this could mean, but I suppose it might be taken to mean that whatever predicates he satisfied necessarily. In this respect, though presumably not in others, he would be assimilated to a number. This is not indeed true of all the predicates his numbers satisfy, but it is true of some of them, and these would furnish the analogy. In fact, I think it is very doubtful whether the comparison is tenable. There is no need to press the point, as this move does nothing to save the argument. For even if it be granted that if the predicates in question are satisfied at all, they are satisfied necessarily, it remains a mere assumption that they are satisfied at all. Sometimes when it is said that God is a necessary being, what is meant is that he is a being, and indeed the only being, that contains in itself the reason for its own existence. This was the position, or one of the positions, taken by St. Thomas Aquinas, who did not believe that the ontological argument was valid, but thought that there had to be a necessary being in the foregoing sense. This definition of God was accepted by Spinoza, and led in his case to the identification of God with nature. The difficulty is to understand how such a definition could possibly be satisfied. If what is meant by a reason is a logical ground, the implication would be that God's existence follows from his essence, and we are back with the ontological argument. If what is meant is a cause, it is hard to see what sense can be attached to the proposition that something causes itself. What is the difference, one may ask, between saying that something causes itself and saying that it has no cause? In St. Thomas's case, the fundamental idea appears to have been that the world cannot just happen to exist in the way that it does. We have theories which account more or less successfully for the observable facts, but the propositions which figure in these theories are themselves contingent. Or, if the theories take the form of deductive systems, it is a contingent matter that their axioms are satisfied. To bring the facts under laws is not to show that they could not have been otherwise, but only to fit them into general patterns. We seek to simplify these patterns by developing more far-reaching theories. But however far we go, we always end in the position that this is how things generally are. The question why they are so is answered only by the production of another theory, which leaves us with the same question to be asked again. The answer that we need is one that assures us not just that this is how things are, but that this is how they must be. But such an answer can be forthcoming only if the final explanation is found in the existence of a deity whose actions proceed from his nature, and whose nature could not be different from what it is. There is an echo of this reasoning in the writings of modern existentialists, who conclude that the world is absurd just because everything in it might have been otherwise. Those who take this position do not see any reason to believe that there is a God, but they imply that if only there were a God, the world would have a significance which it tragically lacks. In this they are mistaken. The search for an ultimate reason is emotionally understandable, but it is not intellectually coherent. To begin with, the recourse to a deity will not explain anything unless it yields hypotheses which we can successfully project, and we shall see presently that it is doubtful whether this is so. Let us suppose, however, this condition can be satisfied. Let us suppose that we can attribute purposes to God which account for the way in which the world is organized. Would it not be a contingent fact that he has these purposes? No, it is said, because they will be in accordance with his nature. Being what he is bound to have these purposes. But then, is it not a contingent fact that he has this nature, that he is, for example, benevolent rather than malevolent? No, it is said again, because his nature is included in his definition. But then we return to the fallacy of the ontological argument. Not only that, but the necessity which is attributed to God's actions and the explanatory role which they are supposed to play are incompatible. From necessary propositions, only necessary propositions follow. Their content is wholly abstract. They are consistent with everything that might actually happen. But an explanation derives its power from not being consistent with everything that might actually happen. It favors one actual pattern in contrast to others which are logically possible. So if one could think of the history of the world as being regulated by God's decisions, one would have to allow both that its history could conceivably have been different, and that the God's decisions could also have been different if they were themselves to be explicable. Here, too, there would have to be a point at which the explanation stopped. No further reason would be given why God's nature was what it was, or, if this were made a matter of necessity, why there was a being with such a nature. If it were rational to settle for an explanation of this sort, the reason would not be that it did away with contingency, but that it made sense of our experiences in a way that scientific theories did not. But then it would have to be shown that this was so. It wouldn't be enough to say that there was some explanation of this kind which we hadn't fathomed. This would be permissible only if the existence of God had been independently established. If the positing of a deity is to be justified by its explanatory value, the explanation has actually to be given. Can it be given? Only, it would seem, if we are able to detect a pattern in the course of events which can be held to support the hypothesis that they are planned. We may then be able to develop a theory about the intentions of the planner which can be empirically tested. Again, it will not be enough to say that there is some plan or other. It has to be a system that we can successfully project. The belief that the world affords sufficient evidence of an ulterior plan is responsible for the argument in favour of the existence of a God, which is commonly known as the argument from design. The proponents of this argument do not take it to show that there necessarily is a God, but only that the assumption of his existence is a reasonable hypothesis. Their position is elegantly and fairly stated by one of the participants in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. Look round the world. Contemplate the whole, every part of it. You will find it to be nothing but one great machine, subdivided into an infinite number of lesser machines, which again admit of subdivisions to a degree beyond what human senses and faculties can trace and explain. All these various machines, and even their most minute parts, are adjusted to each other with an accuracy which ravishes into admiration all men who have ever contemplated them. The curious adapting of means to ends throughout all nature resembles exactly, though it much exceeds, the productions of human contrivance, of human design, thought, wisdom, and intelligence. Since, therefore, the effects resemble each other, we are led to infer, by all the rules of analogy, that the causes also resemble, and that the author of nature is somewhat similar to the mind of man, though possessed of much larger faculties, proportioned to the grandeur of the work which he has executed. Before we try to evaluate this argument, let us take a closer look at the conclusion. What properties is the author of nature supposed to have, and how is he related to the world for which he is made responsible? In the first place, as one of the other participants in Hume's dialogue remarks, there is nothing in the analogy to favour the assumption of a single author rather than a multiplicity. There is nothing to favour the assumption that the world as we find it is the fruit of his only attempt to make a world, rather than the outcome of previous experiments on his own part or on that of others. If anything, the analogy would point the other way. There is nothing either to license the inference that he is eternal, or indeed that he is incorporeal. Since all the designers we have actually observed have been mortal and embodied, the analogy, if it were to be pressed, would again point the other way. It would suggest that his faculties are larger than ours, but not that he is omnipotent, nor yet that he is benevolent. The description of benevolence to him would require us to find empirical evidence, not merely that the world had an author, but that it had an author who meant well by the creatures whom he had put into it. What now of the designer's relation to the world? If one supposes there to have been an act of creation, I do not see how one can avoid the conclusion that it took place at some time. If one supposes this to be the first instant in time, one will find it difficult to say in what sense the author of nature existed antecedently to his creation. The idea that he existed outside time is one to which it is difficult to attach any meaning. It is true that abstract entities can be said to exist outside time, if they can be said to exist at all. But the activities that are attributed to the deity are hardly such as are consistent with his existing after the fashion of an abstract entity. A more intelligible theory would be that events in his history temporarily preceded the act of creation. This would be in a way to include him in the universe, but on the assumption of his existence, he would anyhow have to be included, if the universe was taken to comprehend everything that there is. The creation of the world as we know it would then appear more as a transformation, a radical change in the total course of events, though not necessarily as a transformation of pre-existing matter. It is, however, to be noted that the analogy with the makers of human artifacts is still further weakened if we suppose the material world to have been created out of nothing at all. In view of these difficulties, the proponents of this argument might be better advised to lay more stress upon the metaphor of the author of nature. Instead of comparing the world to a machine, which needed to be designed and built, they could compare it to a play, which needed to be written and directed. Among other things, this accords better with the ordinary concept of creation. The author, who would also be spectator and critic, would exist in time, but the time in which he existed would be incommensurable with that of the incidents in the play, which would have its own spatio-temporal structure. The participants in the play would not be able to verify the existence of its author, except on the dubious assumption that when they had played their parts, they were somehow translated into his world. But it might be maintained they could attach sense to the hypothesis that he existed, as the fundamental principle of an explanatory system which they could use to account for the proceedings on their stage. But now the question arises whether the character of the world as we know it gives any support to these analogies. The fact that regularities are detectable in it is not sufficient, for we have seen that no describable world can fail to exhibit some regularity. Neither is it sufficient that some processes within it are goal-directed, for the fact that ends are pursued and sometimes attained within a system is not a proof that the system as a whole is directed towards any end. What needs to be shown is that the entire universe presents the appearance of a teleological system. If one prefers the dramatic analogy, the play has to have a moral, or at least some discernible plot. Can this requirement be met? It does not seem that it can. None of those who have compared the world to a vast machine has ever made any serious attempt to say what the machine could be for. They have spoken of there being an overall purpose, but have not said what it was. Again, it will not do to say that there is a plan, but one too intricate for us to fathom. This answer might pass muster if the existence of a deity had been independently established. But if the sole reason given for believing in his existence is that the book of nature must have had an author, then the grounds for taking this metaphor seriously have to be produced. Insofar as theists have held any view at all about the purpose for which the world was created, they have generally assumed that it had something to do with the emergence of man. This is a view which it is perhaps natural for men to take, but hardly one that would be supported by a dispassionate consideration of the scientific evidence. Not only did man make a very late appearance upon the scene in a very small corner of the universe, but it is not even probable that having made his appearance, he is there to stay. As Russell put it, the second law of thermodynamics makes it scarcely possible to doubt that the universe is running down, and that ultimately nothing of the slightest interest will be possible anywhere. Of course, it is open to us to say that when that time comes, God will wind the machinery up again. But if we do say this, we can base our assertion only upon faith, not upon one shred of scientific evidence. So far as scientific evidence goes, the universe has crawled by slow stages to a somewhat pitiful result on this earth, and is going to crawl by still more pitiful stages to a condition of universal death. If this is taken to be as evidence of purpose, I can only say that the purpose is one that doesn't appeal to me. I see no reason, therefore, to believe in any sort of God, however vague and however attenuated. Is there any support for religious belief in the fact that men have moral sentiments to which their actions sometimes answer? The view that there is has been quite widely held. The main arguments which have been advanced in its favour are, first, that only the agency of God can account for the existence of morality, and secondly, that God's authority is needed to give our moral standards some objective validity. The first of these arguments seems very weak. The assumption which underlies it is that it is natural for men to behave only in a purely selfish manner. Consequently, if they sometimes forego their interests, or what they believe to be their interests in order to serve others, or because they think that the action which promotes their interests is wrong, or that some other course of action is morally binding on them, the ability to behave in this unnatural way must have been given to them by a higher power. Even if the starting point of this argument were true, the reasoning would not be cogent, since it ignores the possibility that moral behavior can be adequately explained in terms of social conditioning. But in fact it isn't true. Antecedently to any actual observations that are made of human behavior, there is no reason to expect it either to be selfish or to be unselfish. There is no reason to expect it either to conform or not to conform to any particular moral code. If it seems to us more natural for men to pursue their individual interests, it is only because they most commonly do so, at any rate in our own form of society. I believe that there are or have been societies which it is more common for men to pursue the interests of some group which they are members, their family, or clan, or tribe. But even if the prevalent tendency in all societies were for men to behave selfishly, it would not follow that unselfish behavior was unnatural, in the sense of being contrary to nature. Nothing that actually happens is contrary to nature, though there are some actions that we misleadingly call unnatural as a way of expressing our disapproval of them. In fact, I think that a good case can be made for saying that altruistic impulses are innate. They may be initially weaker in small children than the self-regarding or aggressive impulses. If they are not innate, at least the evidence shows that we have the capacity to acquire them. But how do we obtain this capacity? This question is on a level with any other question about the causes of human behavior. It is no more and no less difficult than the question how we obtain our capacity to injure one another. If there were any good reason to believe that men were the outcome of a God's creation, their Creator would be equally responsible for all their characteristics, however much or little we esteem them. Conversely, if there is otherwise no good reason to believe that men were so created, the fact that they behave unselfishly as well as selfishly to each other does not provide one. In dealing with the argument that a God is required to ensure the objectivity of moral standards, we need to distinguish carefully between the motives for morality and its possible grounds. There is no doubt that belief in a God has frequently been the source of moral incentives. Sometimes the motive has been the altruistic one of love for a deity or a saint, whose wishes one believes oneself to be carrying out, or love for other human beings, on the ground that they are equally the children of God. Perhaps more frequently, it has been the prudential motive of fear of future punishment or hope of future reward. It was the belief that men were not generally capable of behaving decently without this prudential motive that led Voltaire to say that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. This is a good epigram, but like many good epigrams, it probably distorts the truth. I do not know that a scientific study has ever been made of this question, but if one were to be made, I doubt if it would reveal any strong correlation either of morally admirable behavior with religious belief or of morally reprehensible behavior with its absence. Much good has been done in the name of religion, but also very much evil. When the long history of religious intolerance and persecution is taken into account, together with the tendency of religious hierarchies to side with the oppressors rather than the oppressed, it is arguable that the evil has outweighed the good. Many bad men have indeed been irreligious, but many agnostics and atheists have led very decent lives. Neither do those who are sincerely religious always live up to their good principles. My own conjecture is that the factors which make for the observance or disregard of morality are mainly psychological and social, and that religious belief has had a smaller influence either way than is commonly supposed. However this may be, it is clear that to show that belief in God had had a predominantly good effect would not be to show that the belief was true, any more than showing that it had a predominantly bad effect would be to show that it was false. I suspect that the widespread assumption that religious belief is necessary for the maintenance of moral standards arises not so much from any assessment of the empirical evidence as from a tacit or explicit acceptance of the proposition that if there is no God, there is no reason to be moral. What is meant is that there is then no justification for morality, but because of the ambiguity of the word reason, the fallacious inference is drawn that there is neither any ground nor any motive. The conclusion sought is that since there is reason to be moral, there is a God. This is the obverse of the Nietzschean idea that since God is dead, everything is permitted. Whichever way it is taken, this proposition contains two serious errors, apart from the fallacy of thinking that the absence of grounds for morality entails the absence of motives. The first error is to suppose that morality needs an ulterior justification. The second error is to suppose that a God could supply it. The fallacy which is involved in thinking that morals could be founded on divine authority has been exposed by many philosophers, but perhaps most clearly and succinctly by Russell. Theologians, he says, have always taught that God's decrees are good, and this is not a mere tautology. It follows that goodness is logically independent of God's decrees. The point is that moral standards can never be justified merely by an appeal to authority, whether the authority is taken to be human or divine. There has to be the additional premise that the person whose dictates we are to follow is good, or that what he commands is right, and this cannot be the mere tautology that he is what he is, or that he commands what he commands. This doesn't mean that we cannot look for guidance in conduct to those whom we judge to be better or wiser or more experienced than ourselves. To a greater or lesser extent, we can and do take our morals on trust. But in so doing, we are making a moral decision. We are at least implicitly judging that the rules which we have been brought up to respect, or the verdicts of our mentor, are morally right. And again, this is not the mere tautology that these rules and verdicts just are what they are. But if a moral code cannot be founded on authority, neither can it be founded on metaphysics or on science or on empirical matters of fact. Scientific and factual considerations are indeed relevant to morals because of the bearing which they have upon the application of our moral principles. We have to know what the situation is in which we are placed, and what the consequences of different actions are likely to be. If, for example, we think it right to try to maximize human happiness, a scientific approach to the practical problems may instruct us how best to set about it. The adoption of such a principle is, however, something which is not dictated to us by the facts. It is a decision for which it may be that we are not able to give any further reason, just as we may not be able to give any further reason for the value that we attach to justice or to liberty. In the end, it is a matter of finding principles which one is prepared to stand by, and when they conflict, as for most of us they sometimes will, are giving more weight to one or another according to the circumstances of the particular case. This does not mean that we have to regard every moral standpoint as equally correct. In holding a moral principle, one regards it as valid for others besides oneself, whether they think so or not. In cases where they do not think so, it will depend on their circumstances whether one judges that they are unenlightened or morally at fault. What has to be admitted is that there is no way of proving that they are mistaken. The most that one could do is argue ad hominem. One may be able to show that their principles are inconsistent, or they are based on factual assumptions which are false, or they are the product of bad reasoning, or they lead to consequences which their advocates are not prepared to stand by. Even if we are successful in this, we may not persuade them to change their principles, but at least we shall have advanced some reason why they should. It may be, however, that we cannot find any such flaws in their position, and still want to regard it as morally untenable. In that case, discussion can go no further. This stage is seldom reached, because it is nearly always possible to find a sufficient basis of moral agreement for the argument to proceed, but it has to be accepted as a possibility. Neither is this just the outcome of a subjective attitude to morals. The position is no different for one who believes that value predicates stand for objective, unanalyzable ethical properties. In the case where his intuitions of what is good or right conflict with those of some other moralist, he has no means of proving that they are correct. The difference between him and the subjectivist is that whereas the subjectivist is content to say that these are his principles and leave it at that, The believer in absolute values wants to say that his moral judgments are objectively true. Since, however, his only criterion of their truth is his own intuition, the difference is negligible. The merit of this sort of objectivism is that it avoids any suggestion of moral nihilism. Its demerit is its implication that value judgments are descriptive of something otherworldly, whereas fundamentally they are not descriptive judgments at all. I say fundamentally because they sometimes are descriptive of natural states of affairs. They convey the implication that the objects or actions in question come up to standard or fail to do so. But then, the acceptance of these standards is presupposed. From a logical point of view, the association of religion with morals appears rather arbitrary. Not only can morality not be founded on a God's decrees, but there seems no reason why the belief that the world had an intelligent creator should entail any conclusions about the way in which men ought to behave. If the purposes of the creator were thought to be known, one might derive some conclusions about the ways in which men would in fact behave, but that would be all. In the case of Christianity, however, the association is cemented by the belief that God, in the person of his own Son, turned himself temporarily into a man and underwent torture and a painful death in order to make it possible for sinful men to be redeemed from the punishment which he would otherwise have inflicted. In assessing this belief, we have to balance the testimony in favor of such events as the virgin birth and the resurrection, not only against their improbability in the light of the rest of our experience, but also against the strangeness of the motive which is attributed to God. For it is very strange. In the first place, the very notion of vindictive punishment, the idea that if someone does harm to others, or even in certain cases to himself, one is required to do harm to him, is one to which objection may be taken on moral grounds, and it becomes even harder to accept when the suffering is vicarious, when one person is punished on account of what others have done. Neither is the objection removed when the scapegoat himself elects to be sacrificed, for what is objectionable is that there should be need for any scapegoat at all. If God wished to absolve men from their sins, why could he not simply do so, without exacting any price from himself or anyone else? Why, indeed, if he was so deeply concerned with men's behavior, and had the power to make them as he chose, did he not endow them with a nature and a form of life which would ensure that they always behaved in ways of which he approved? The usual answer to this question is that to have contrived that men should live in this fashion would have been inconsistent with giving them free will, and that it is better that we should have this freedom, however badly we employ it, than that we should simply be a deity's puppets. This answer is sometimes also given in an attempt to reconcile the suffering that men endure with the supreme benevolence which is ascribed to God. But here it wholly fails, if only for the reason that much of this suffering is due to causes which are beyond our control. Does it fail also in the other case? It is sometimes argued that the power which is ascribed to God of foreseeing everything that happens is inconsistent with men's freedom. But this is a mistake. There is some difficulty, as we shall see, in understanding what is meant by saying that a man does something of his own free will. But if a proposition of this sort is ever true, it must be consistent with the tautology that his actions will be what they will be. But if the man's actions will be what they will be, whether they are done freely or not, then equally someone who says what they will be predicts them truly, whether they are done freely or not. It makes no difference here whether the predictions are lucky guesses or manifestations of knowledge. From the fact that someone knows what I shall do, it does indeed follow that I shall do it, for the purely semantic reason that this is part of what is meant by saying that he knows that I shall. It does not follow that I am compelled to do it, that I shall not be free to act otherwise. The most that can be inferred is that if I do have this freedom, I shall in fact not exercise it. The position becomes different, however, when one thinks of a God as having made men what they are. The suggestion is that he endowed them biologically with certain initial dispositions and capacities, but left them free within certain limits to choose whether and to what extent the dispositions are realized or the capacities developed. A man's character, from which his actions largely proceed, is thought to be the joint product of his initial equipment, the physical and social stimuli to which he has been subjected, and his own past choices. The formation of his character may narrow his freedom. He may, through physical or social conditioning, or as the consequence of his own free actions, be deprived of the power to make choices he once was able to make. But except in abnormal circumstances, such as that of extreme senility, when the man ceases to be a responsible agent, his freedom of choice never vanishes altogether. But now we may ask how it comes about that he chooses to act in this way rather than that. Through the exercise of his will. But what does this mean? The idea of the will as a piece of psychological mechanism which converts intentions into physical movements appears to be mythical. All that seems actually to happen is that we think about the advantages and disadvantages of different courses of action, and having come to some conclusion, simply act. More often, when the action is part of some habitual routine, we perform it without any prior deliberation. In neither case do we feel we are prodded into action by what Ryle has called an occult inner thrust. Perhaps a desire can be represented as such a thrust, but then we do not need another one to enable us to set about fulfilling the desire. We may need to concentrate our attention or to make a physical effort, but that is all. In any case, even if there were a recognizable mechanism with which the will could be identified, we could still ask in any given instance how it came to work as it did, because that was the way which its owner chose to operate it. But then we return to the question how he came to make this choice. Was it due to the way God made him, or was spontaneous occurrence a matter of chance? On neither assumption does it seem reasonable for God to hold him responsible for what he did. But then is it reasonable for us to hold him responsible, whether or not we assign any part to a God? Let us look more closely at this problem. There is no doubt that we think ourselves able to draw a distinction between cases in which someone does something of his own free will and cases in which this isn't so. What then does the distinction consist in? I think that the best way to try to answer this question is to approach it from the negative side. Under what conditions is our freedom of action thought to be non-existent, or else so limited as seriously to attenuate our responsibility? The most obvious class of cases in which our freedom is thought to be non-existent consists of those in which the prospective action is one which is regarded as being physically impossible for the agent to perform, or physically impossible for him to avoid. These conditions obtain when the circumstances are known to be such that in conjunction with accepted physical laws they exclude the agent's performance of the action or his avoidance of it. This is, however, not always enough to exculpate him, since it may be held that he could and should have prevented the circumstances from arising. It may be physically impossible for me to keep an appointment, because there is no means by which I can get there in time, but I was perhaps not obliged to let this happen. I may not be able to avoid falling asleep at a time when wakefulness is demanded of me, because I have taken a drug, but it can be argued I didn't have to take it. One may also be held responsible for one's general loss of some physical capacity. This is thought to be due to one's own folly or negligence. A second class of cases, where freedom is taken to be lacking, consists of those in which some action is thought incapable of being performed by the agent or incapable of being avoided, because of the operation of a psychological law. These cases are more contentious because of our difficulty in finding psychological laws that are agreed to hold universally. It is, however, generally admitted one has to acquire skills in order to exercise them. One is not expected to speak a language that one hasn't learned. There are also thought to be neurotic or psychotic states, which affect people in such a way that the performance or the avoidance of certain actions is not within their power. Here again they may sometimes be held responsible to a greater or lesser degree for falling into this condition. The circumstances in which our freedom may be thought to be diminished without being altogether removed are very various. For instance, one may feel oneself bound by a moral or legal obligation which would be infringed by some action one would otherwise wish or think it right to perform. One may be subject to emotional pressures which it is thought excusable to give way to, even if they are not thought to be irresistible. One may be acting under the influence of some false belief. One may be under the control of another person, as when one has been hypnotized or brainwashed. One may be exposed to blackmail or to torture or to other menaces. Even when one is threatened with death, one is considered free to defy the threat, but in most circumstances this wouldn't be thought reasonable. In all these cases, the idea of what it is reasonable to expect a man to do plays a large part in our assessment of responsibility. From this it emerges that when one is held responsible for anything that one has done or failed to do, there is always the implication that one could reasonably have been expected to act otherwise. There may indeed have been very little likelihood that one would act otherwise, but that may be held to be the result of one's own past conduct, which could reasonably have been expected to be different at some earlier stage. But now we must ask what is meant by saying of someone in a given situation that he could have avoided acting as he did. The answer is, I believe, that the fiction that he did act differently is one that we find acceptable. Whether the fictitious action is thought to be reasonable depends partly on what we consider to be normal behavior and partly on our moral standards. What makes it acceptable as a possibility is just that it is not excluded by the conjunction of the attendant circumstances, as they are known to us, with the established hypotheses of our explanatory system. To say that an occurrence is not ruled out by the explanatory system which we actually have is not, however, to say that this will always be so. I think it unlikely that there will ever be a working system which enables us to account for every human action in every detail. But equally, I do not think that there is any form of action of which one can be sure that it will never come within the reach of established universal laws. Let us, however, assume that we have to be content with statistical laws. In that case, it will be a matter of chance whether or not a particular action conforms to the prevailing frequency, and it is not clear why a man should be held responsible for an action which occurs by chance. The same would apply if the action were of a sort that, so far as we could discover, was not governed even by a statistical law. For then we should have to conclude either that there was some explanation which had so far eluded us, or such actions were entirely fortuitous. It has indeed been suggested that these are not the only alternatives. Even if a man's actions are not governed by causal laws, he may still have reasons for doing them, and therefore be held responsible. But all that this comes to is these actions are explained in terms of generalizations of tendency, with the result that, in default of a stronger explanation, the conformity of a particular action to a recognized tendency remains a matter of chance. Some philosophers have argued that even if we were able to represent all human actions as causally determined, we should still have a use for the concepts of free will and responsibility. They remark, quite correctly, that we should still be able to distinguish between behavior which occurs independently of the agent's volition and actions which are done deliberately, in the sense that we do not admit the fiction of their occurrence in the actual circumstances without the agents having chosen to do them. Free actions can then be characterized, in the way that Locke and others have proposed, as those in which the agent is not prevented from doing what he chooses, no matter how his choices are themselves determined. And the justification of reward and punishment will be that they exert a causal influence upon the agent's future choices, as well as on the choices of others who may be expected to learn from the example. This is a tenable position, but I think that its advocates underrate the extent to which it departs from our ordinary way of thinking. It is true that considerations of utility are brought to bear upon the character and extent of the rewards and punishments that we think ourselves justified in giving. Even so, our primary reason for rewarding or punishing anyone is that he deserves it. And it is just this notion of desert that our analysis of the concept of free will has put in question. If our outlook were purely utilitarian, we should take much more kindly than we mostly do to the idea of preventive punishment. And we should be much more ready than we mostly are to allow those who have done wrong to escape any reprisal, when no greater good is likely to result from it. Not only do we treat freedom of choice as entailing responsibility in a way that seems hardly rational in the light of this analysis, but we also ascribe an intrinsic value to it. We try by various methods of education to impel people along the proper paths, but we dislike the idea of employing means of conditioning, such as the use of drugs, which might effectively ensure this result. We feel they should be left free to choose what they will do, even if they choose badly. We wish to influence their choice, but not wholly to determine it. I admit that I share this feeling, but I do not know how to justify it. So long as we go through the process of choosing, why should it matter to us how our choices are explained? What is the value in their being subject only to statistical laws, let alone in their being totally inexplicable? To say that a God who exacted retribution for men's conduct would not be benevolent or rational is not in itself to say that there is no such God. Even so, the existence of a deity of whatever character would have to have been established on other grounds before we could profitably speculate about his attitude to men, and so far these grounds have not been forthcoming. There are, however, those who would say that in pursuing the question whether there is adequate evidence for a God's existence, we've been approaching the subject of religion in the wrong way. According to them, the question we should have been asking is not whether the proposition that God exists is true as a matter of fact, or acceptable as an explanatory hypothesis, but rather what function the belief in God fulfills in the lives of those who hold it. The justification for the belief may then be said to be that it makes the lives of those who hold it appear meaningful to them in a way that they otherwise wouldn't. This is substantially the position taken by the pragmatist William James. Having spoken in one book of the craving of our nature for an ultimate peace behind all tempests, a blue zenith above all clouds, he criticizes in another the attempts of what he calls systematic theology to define the attributes of God. Wherein, he asks, is such a definition really instructive? It means less than nothing in its pompous robe of adjectives. Pragmatism alone can read a positive meaning into it, and for that she turns her back upon the intellectualist point of view altogether. God's in his heaven, all's right with the world. That's the real heart of your theology, and for that you need no rationalist definitions. Similarly, in his Gifford lectures on the varieties of religious experience, he speaks of his wish to vindicate the instinctive belief of mankind, God is real, since he produces real effects. What he takes these real effects to be is no more than the feelings of greater energy, security and satisfaction which he thinks are enjoyed by those who hold religious beliefs. As a psychological hypothesis, this could be questioned. For instance, the thesis of eternal damnation, which has been a prominent feature of much Christian teaching, is not likely to produce a feeling of greater security. On the other hand, there is no doubt that many people derive solace from the idea of their having a spiritual father who watches over them, especially when it is allied to the hope that he will secure to them in a future life the happiness they may not have found in this one. To infer from this, however, there is such a father, one needs to accept James's pragmatic theory that since it is not to be expected of a religious hypothesis that it will either accord or fail to accord with any observable fact, the criterion for its truth is just that the vague assurance which it gives that all's right with the world is a source of emotional satisfaction. This is in line with the view of some contemporary theists that the doctrine associated with the religious practices in which they engage is acceptable as a useful myth. This view is so modest that it is hard to take issue with it, unless one wants to argue that the myth is harmful. But it does appear open to the practical objection that the satisfaction which most believers derive from their acceptance of religious doctrine depends upon their not judging it as mythical. A myth which is generally seen to be a myth must be in some danger of losing its utility. But without the help of such a myth, can life be seen as having any meaning? The simple answer is it can have just as much meaning as one is able to put into it. There is indeed no ground for thinking that human life in general serves any ulterior purpose. But this is no bar to a man's finding satisfaction in many of the activities that make up his life, or to his attaching value to the ends which he pursues, including some that he himself will not live to see realized. One may deplore the fact that life is so short, but if it were not independently worth living, there would be no good reason to wish it prolonged. Where the discarding of the Christian myth may have a cruel effect, is in the denial to those whose lives have not been happy of any serious hope that they will survive to find the balance redressed.